My name is Dominique Mohammed. I'm 29 years old. I'm from Portland, Oregon. And this past year, I've faced and defeated one of the toughest battles that I've ever faced in my life. When I was 20 years old, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma stage 4. I'm gonna bring on fellow cancer survivors to show you guys not only that you can beat any cancer, but that you can beat your zombie, whatever that is in life.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of BeastvsZombie. If you haven't already, follow the podcast on all social media platforms. Follow on Spotify and YouTube to see the full videos and stay up to date on new episodes coming out every other week. Today, I have a buddy of mine, Christian Martin, on the call with me. He has overcame colon cancer and has an amazing story that we're looking forward to sharing with you. So let's get right into it. How did you find out that you had colon cancer?
So back in January of 2023, I had moved back in with my parents, and I initially had like small pains, little spasms, random pains that I couldn't really explain, but they were so few and far between that I really didn't think too much of it until it started getting a little worse. And when it did, around like the center of January, I didn't have health insurance at the time. So first thing I did was go straight to a health insurance office and enroll. They asked me the question, do you need this like now? And I knew if I answered yes, I likely still wouldn't get treatment until it started anyways. So I said no, just because I didn't want there to be any issues or complications getting insurance because of a possible pre-existing condition. But as soon as it kicked in, started going to the doctors in February, and it took them up until about May to actually figure out what it was. Initially, they thought it was prostatitis, something that's typically more diagnosed in older gentlemen like 60, 65. And I had all the symptoms of it, but I did also notice that the symptoms of it were the exact same as bladder cancer. So I went to my doctors, they tested me for all the UTs, STs, everything to make sure it's none of that, and when everything kept coming back negative, they referred me to a urologist, and in my first appointment with the urologist, pretty much just said, alright, your symptoms align with prostatitis, that's your diagnosis, and that's about it. And I asked him, like, well, what are the chances you think this is cancer? And he looked at me and he just said, bladder cancer in a 22-year-old? Practically impossible. And while he wasn't wrong, it wasn't bladder cancer. I mean, it was cancer, but because I asked that question, he ordered a blood test as well as an ultrasound. And then when I was getting that ultrasound done, very notably, it was it was like a nurse that was practicing with somebody who was more experienced, and they were doing the ultrasound, and they're just going around. She's like telling her to take like photos of certain things. And then it got to a point where she hovered over, and the woman who was instructing the nurse goes, oh, get a photo of that. And I'm like, what is there? And they can't discuss what they find, so they're like, well, your doctor will discuss it with you. Come to find, they saw a mass in my bladder. So they let me know, and then I went back to my urologist as soon as they pretty much found out. 3 days later, I was in an operating room. They went in to cystoscopy. So I was asleep for this one. Luckily, I wasn't for the first one. That was excruciating. Do you know what a cystoscopy is?
No, what is a cystoscopy?
A cystoscopy is...
Cystoscopy.
It is... So the only way for a urologist to be able to know what's going on inside your bladder is to take a look inside. And if they don't do that through surgical incision, there's only one way they can go in. Very, very painful way. I had that done once when I was awake, right after they found out. And then pretty much he was like, yeah, there's a tumor inside your bladder. Like, there's a mass. It doesn't look cancerous on the surface. But we won't know until we really, like, dig into it. So literally 3 days later, I was in the operating room again. And he essentially went in. He said what he did was hollowed out the inside of the tumor, but left like the outside of it just because he didn't want to pierce like my bladder wall. And then essentially sent me home, recovered a little bit, and then got me set up with an oncologist. My oncologist ends up, 2-3 months of appointments, sometimes up to 3 appointments a day. It was just 2-3 months of doctors, and that was all it was. But by the end of those 2-3 months, I had my port put in, which has since been removed. You can see the scar there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I have a scar right here. If you could see it, where's it at? I don't know if you could see it.
The tattoo covers
it's right here. It's right
Yeah.
here in the middle. It's actually healed up now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What kind did you have?
So I had lymphoma. I had Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Okay.
So I had cancer. Basically, the way I found out was I had a lymph node that was swollen out of my neck.
Oh.
And I thought it was just like a knot in my neck. And I went to a chiropractor to get rubbed out. Mm-hmm. And they sent me to a doctor who actually immediately knew when he saw me. He couldn't tell me, right? He couldn't diagnose me because we had to do tests and biopsies and confirm everything. But he knew right away that I had cancer. And he told me that's what he thought it was, right? Again, he couldn't diagnose me. But yeah, so I had lymphoma. I did 2 bone marrow transplants 2 separate times. Overall, it took me about 10 years to actually finally get into remission. I was in remission for 3 years during that period, and it actually came back. So I had a relapse or whatever you want to call it.
Recurrence,
Yeah, a recurrence. And then I beat it again. So yeah, that's kind of what I went through. So how long, overall, did it take you to from when you started to being able to finish? And even now, you said you had some more complications. How long did it take you to get through all that?
So initially, like I said, I started having pain in January of 2023. Diagnosed in May. It was May 2nd of 2023 I was diagnosed, and then February 2nd of 2024 I went under for surgery, and that's when I was officially declared in remission.
Nice.
I was on IV antibiotics till the end of April. I showed up to 2 different concerts with my port still connected, needle hanging out and everything, so...
Okay, yeah.
But, at that point I was so ready to get out, because after a year of just being home, and it's a year to me felt pretty long. I can't imagine, your experience having gone through it for as long as you did, especially. And I'm not out of the woods yet. I'm still having complications, and recurrence is always a factor, but my oncologist did specifically state that the kind of cancer I had doesn't have a necessarily higher risk of recurrence, unlike if it were actually bladder cancer. That's something when they first found the tumor, my urologist had told me they were going to have to remove the entirety of my bladder and reconstruct one at a small bowel called, don't remember the name of it, but essentially it's an artificial bladder made out of small bowel. It doesn't have as much. They'd have to reattach sphincters. It's a a lot more serious procedure. I would have lost my prostate in the process, but luckily, just because from the moment I was diagnosed and I told my mom and everything, she honestly she's an absolute angel. She took care of me day in, day out. Anything I needed, whether it be medicine, food, anything, she was there. She really helped me with just for context, my family's from Mexico, both my parents. My mom's from the middle of nowhere, a place called San Luis Potosí. It's 2 hours from the main city, and the nearest thing you would even consider a city is 45 minutes from where she grew up.
Okay.
So growing up for her, a lot of health was just natural. Everything came from the earth. So essentially, I had gone from being one of the pickiest eaters that only ate pretty bad foods, which honestly I think is one of the big factors why I ended up having cancer. Just the amount of processed foods I was consuming on top of stress. I was full-time school, full-time work, and I was also managing a relationship. So just a lot on my plate combined with really bad eating, I think is what manifested it. But after changing my eating habits completely, I stopped eating fried foods and refined sugars for the entirety of my treatment. I actively to this day still drink like aloe vera, green juices. After every chemo, my mom would make me a beet juice. And it's so interesting when you ask your doctors about like natural remedies or ways of fixing things, because I had asked, after my first chemo, I had gotten a neutropenic fever and ended up in the hospital. And when I got out of the hospital, they're like, we have to postpone your chemo because your platelet count's low. That happened twice, and then I told my mom about it, and I had asked my doctor, I'm like, how can I raise my platelet count? And they're like, you can't, you just have to wait. And I was like, okay, and then I told my mom, she's like, nah, I don't believe it, and she started making me, it was a beet juice with orange, lemon, and carrots. And ever since, once I started drinking that, like once or twice after chemo, I never had issues with my platelets again. Like, I think there's a big issue with the medical system in not allowing for more natural, like, I understand, because at the same time you don't want to put people's faith in something that's not guaranteed. But I don't know. I feel like there was a lot of help I got outside of the medical system, and had I not had that from my mom in all the different ways she did that for me, I don't think it would have been as good as it did, because I only did 12 chemos, and that shrunk a softball-sized tumor down to 7 millimeters.
Okay, wow.
And my oncologist, it was 12 total, yeah.
12.
Even my oncologist was like, it's pretty crazy how fast your tumor's reducing. Like, they didn't normally see people have such drastic reduction going from softball to pea size in 6 months, you know?
Right, okay. Man, that's crazy. And I totally agree with you. Like, right, obviously a doctor, like, is a business, right? And they have to make money somehow, right? Because even going through this whole process, I've met with multiple doctors, I met with dietitians, all types of people to try and find ways through the medical system to help myself through things that I can control, which a lot is your diet, right? And they always just tell you to have a balanced diet, right? They lied to you. They said there's nothing that you could do
and
about
I also,
your platelets.
Yeah, I also noticed as well, when, like, sorry, kind of lost the thought.
Oh no, it's all good. It's all good. So how did you feel like about your care from your doctors, from your nurses, going through your treatments? How did you feel like you were taken care of?
Really good. Honestly,
Right.
I was with Memorial Care, there, who my primary insurance was. My oncologist was in Laguna Hills. He was really good, always very... he was good to respond. The nurse that worked with him also had a direct line where I could text her, so if I ever needed anything, text away, appointments were made, everything. They guided me through everything. I feel like by 2 months in, everything was kind of already being set up for me rather than me having to go out of my way to do it myself, which was really nice, because taking a lot of the stress and pressure out of everything, it was just on me to show up and get it done, you know?
Cool. And so through that period, right? Like what was your treatment plan to start out, and then what was it like going through all your treatments all the way up to your surgery?
Okay. So initially, when I talked to the oncologist, he explained to me, because of my age, they have the ability to go with more aggressive treatments. So where typically they'd treat an older gentleman with colon cancer with a 3-drug regimen, they gave me a 4-drug, so a FOLFIRINOX is what it was called. And that was, I don't remember all the drugs, but the one that really hit me was irinotecan. I had a slight allergy to it, so it made me slow to speak, it made me super drowsy, it completely messed with me, so I had to start being given like Benadryl during my chemos, on top of everything that I was taking for anti-nausea, because nausea was a serious problem for me. So I was on Amend, Zofran, Compazine, and Ativan, and was still struggling not to puke. So it was a lot. During the chemos, I would show up at the infusion center. They'd plug the port, and then they'd have me sit there for about 8 hours, 3 bags. I'd usually sleep through it. Between the Ativan and Benadryl, I was not very conscious. But because they were obviously giving me so much saline, I'd have to get up to go to the restroom a lot. And I still remember very particularly how sluggish and just horrible I felt walking to that bathroom every time. And to this day, the smell of that soap from that bathroom still makes me nauseous.
Yeah, I get that. I totally get that.
Yeah, and I did, like I said, 12 total. After the third one, they had kind of figured out what it is I needed, how to handle it, and how to get through it, so it was pretty routine after that. But just like I had a lot of anticipatory nausea as well, so prior to even getting chemo, just walking into that hospital, in that elevator, I got nauseous every time.
I would get sick on the way.
Yeah,
driving on the
I
way there.
puked. I puked without fail prior to every single chemo after like the third one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like it's like in your head. You know what I'm saying? It's like
it's because
like
you know, especially when you have such a good idea of how you're about to feel in like 2 hours on your way there. You think about it, and there was even foods that I had ate at the beginning of my treatment that by like 4 chemos in, I couldn't even think about without getting nauseous. Like one of the nurses during one of the chemo infusions asked me about it. I'm like, yeah. I can't eat like wheat bread anymore. And then I was like, oh, as soon as I said wheat bread, I was like, oh, give me a bag. And it was out. Like, it was bad.
Yeah, for me, going through the chemo and some other treatments, nausea was definitely the like most overwhelming and the biggest side effect.
Yeah, I luckily didn't have much outside of nausea. Definitely some sluggish. I didn't really have body aches, mouth sores, or any of the other ones, which was a blessing. To deal only with nausea, even if it is bad nausea, I'd rather deal with one thing that's really bad than a lot of things that are only like slightly bad, because then it's kind of like getting hit from every direction. It's a lot more to take versus just phasing one single thing out.
Right. Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah, and just like you, nausea was kind of one of the only things that I really dealt with. Like, obviously, we had low energy because medications
that's
killing
just a given,
all of our cells. But I was still able to stay pretty active during most of my treatments and stuff like that, which I know helped me a lot.
I wasn't, for the most part.
Yeah.
So, I had stopped working, I had stopped going to school, I was diagnosed midway through a semester. Still managed to finish out that semester, with, I believe it was 2 B's and an A, or 2 A's and a B. So I was still happy with that, but I had to take time off school, time off work, and it was just a year of my job being taking care of myself, Because at the end of the day, health is wealth.
Yes, I agree. That's what I did initially too, like, especially because going into it, like, you don't know what's about to happen.
No,
right?
You
like,
don't.
the doctors tell you maybe hear from a friend or family that's maybe gone through it. You can do research online, whatever, but you really don't know until you start going through it.
I think the worst part mentally was the beginning, just because all the unknowns. It's very terrifying when the doctor diagnoses you, like, you have cancer, and you're like, the only thing I know about this word is that it kills people. And that was my impression of it, so initially it was just shock. It was, oh. I wasn't super surprised, because honestly I had a feeling that's what it was going to be. After so many tests, being unable to find what the problem was, this is negative, that's negative, and everything just not adding up, I started thinking about it, especially with all the symptoms being exactly the same. And that's why I asked the question, and that's why they found it,
Yeah. Man, that's super crazy to figure it out like that. The way people find out they have cancer is like all types of random, like, sometime, like, however you want to say it, like, coincidental, or however you want to say it, like, just very interesting ways that people find cancer in their body. And it's important to get, like, checked up and to just stay in tune with your body, have healthcare, like you were talking about in the beginning.
Because I didn't, and I think it's also important to note, prior to all this happening, I hadn't been to a doctor in over 10 years.
Yeah.
As a kid, I mean, growing up, my biggest fear was needles, I hated the doctor with the passion, and it was so difficult to get me to go that my mom had given up on it. Like she, and it's not her fault. It was entirely mine. I mean, should she have forced me to still go? Probably, but like I can't hold her accountable to it when I know how annoying I was being.
Right.
Uh,
That's
but
crazy.
it really goes to show the flip for me, where as a kid it was like avoid the doctor at all costs, and now I'm the one advocating for everybody to get checked out.
Yeah. That's crazy. That's crazy how
Yeah.
that it's interesting that like something how do you say it? Like so impactful has to be like you getting
Yeah.
cancer to get
Yeah.
to that point to kind of it kind of like matures you,
No,
obviously like
100%.
changes your perspective as far
It's
as how you think about it.
especially with the thoughts of like initially where it's like this could kill me, like this could be the end, like my future is not guaranteed. That's a terrifying feeling.
Mm,
I mean, it is for me personally. I've never really struggled with the will to live
mm,
personally, but I also my grandpa passed from cancer.
okay.
But the big difference with him was when he was diagnosed, he gave up. He didn't stay on top of his treatments. He didn't go into his doctors. He just gave up. He just laid there and let it kill him, and it still took it 13 years. Which, had he
Wow.
fought it instead of not doing anything with how long it took to kill him, it was honestly he could have likely beat it or at least had a bit longer of a life. But at
Yeah.
least, at the very least, he served as a really, really good example for what I shouldn't be
Yeah.
in the situation. And my mom very much I grew up in a Catholic household. My mom and dad are both Catholic, but my mom, she came to me and she's like, I know you've never really been very religious, and I'm not telling you need to be like Catholic, but I think you should believe in something. And even raised Catholic, I've always had the idea in the back of my mind, like I've always believed in God. I've just never believed in organized religion. That's where I draw the line because I have a big issue when I go to like church and such. It feels a little culty for me. When deep down, I don't believe that a god would be cruel and would create people specifically to be worshipped, but rather for us to learn our lessons that we were destined to learn. You know.
Yeah. That's cool. I cool. I totally feel that. Right, like I believe in God. I don't go to church on Sundays or anything like that or
It's yeah, my
nothing.
cousin puts it well. It's not about church. It's not about the sacrifices you make for him, but rather it's the relationship you have with him. And that's
Yeah.
the most important thing. And that's something I've always had but never really realized. And this whole experience did bring that out more. I did start going to church and I found it interesting for a while. There's definitely some good lessons to be taken away from it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't convince me, and I'm comfortable in knowing that as long as I am the best person I can possibly be, I don't believe there is a God that wouldn't accept me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's like you. I agree with you. I like it's really just like your relationship with God. You
Mm-hmm.
know, like, and that's kind of on you. You know what that is, and you know where it
Yeah.
is. Um, cool, man. So when you got through your chemos, that's when you did your surgery.
So yeah, I did 12 rounds of chemo, 2 months of rest so that my immune system could recover, and then it ended up being like 2.5 months. And then in February, I actually referred out to City of Hope. I had the option to do so because my insurance would cover both. And I was given essentially the option between a surgeon at Memorial Care or a surgeon at City of Hope. With Memorial Care, I was assigned a surgeon. When I was referred to City of Hope, I was asked specifically which surgeon I wanted, and I had done my research, so I chose, of course, the 5 star. And she did a great job. I still see her often. Her name is Dr. Lily Lai. She's Duarte, City of Hope. Really nice, really, really good and smart woman. I'm happy to have her as one of my doctors for sure.
And what did that surgery entail? Like, what was the process or the procedure that they had to do?
Yeah, so I showed up 5 a.m. The routine, put in an IV, get you prepped, the shower and like the special soap and all that, and then so what I knew going in was they were going to remove the right side of my colon, a piece of my bladder if possible, but they told me it may not be possible, and I did have a chance of losing my entire bladder. I believe they called it a new bladder. Neo bladder, that's what it was. Neo bladder.
Okay.
Is what they said they were going to give me if they couldn't reconstruct the bladder or just put it back together. My original urologist still seemed to want to take out the whole bladder. Another reason I didn't go with Memorial Care. So they did the partial and no issue. They said at the very worst I was going to wake up with bags, a bag attached to my bladder that drains my urine for the rest of my life. But they said the chances of that were quite low. Didn't end up happening, luckily. But I woke up from the surgery, and it went really well for the most part. Right side of my colon, piece of my bladder, 36 lymph nodes. Have quite a bit of scars on my stomach. But I did spend the first week that I was supposed to spend there. I went home for 3 days, and I had to go back because of an infection. So I ended up having to have a second drain put in. I had spent an extra week in the hospital. And honestly, the second week wasn't too bad. It was boring more than anything, but the first week, I've never in my life have I ever felt like I was battling my sanity, but that first week in the hospital was really it. It was excruciating, and no fault of the City of Hope staff at all. Like, it was entirely just the recovery process, but like the first 2 days, I woke up, I had IVs in both of the back of my hands. And when you wake up from a surgery like that, your intestines aren't awake yet. You're not able to process food. So anything that was in my stomach stayed in my stomach for like 2 days before I was actually able to go to the restroom, on top of everything else I put in. And it was mostly just like water, but it built up so much that during the first 2 days, I was having hiccups that would last 5 minutes up till like 4.5 hours was the longest bout of hiccups. I laid there literally from like 4 p.m. till like 8:30 in the night, just hiccups, and then the nurses walked in like I was crying. I was crying, and I told the nurses very specifically, I feel like God is testing me. And in that moment, hiccups were gone. The moment I said that, the hiccups were gone. They went away. And then the next day I was able to use the restroom. Using the restroom because of how bucked up I was caused me nausea. The first time I didn't throw up on the toilet. The second time I did, resulting in both the IVs in my hands, which were like 18 gauge needles, by the way. Both of them exploded. So they had to pull out both IVs and then reinsert 2 new ones into both of my arms. And 18 gauge needles are pretty big, so they hurt really bad.
That's crazy.
At that point, I was at pretty much just numb to it. Like, it was painful, but at that point, I didn't even have the energy to have emotions. And I feel like every 2 days in that hospital for those 7 days was a different struggle. Whether it be pain, whether it be like the IVs, whether it just be eating. When my intestines did finally wake up, eating food, I could feel my food just going into my body through every bit of my intestine. When they first wake up, some parts are contracted and some parts are dilated. So the food can go into the dilated parts easily, but as soon as it goes into the contracted, it hurts. So eating was physically painful for me for a few days as well.
Okay. Yeah. Man, that's crazy. Being stuck in the hospital is no joke. Like when I had bone marrow transplants, I was basically quarantined in the hospital for like a month. So I'd be in there for weeks. And like you said, sometimes it gets real boring. The first bout, all my friends could come visit me, right?
Mm-hmm.
They could come visit me. We play like little video games and board games. And then the second one was during COVID. And the only visitor I was allowed to have you're only allowed to have one visitor the entire period. So for the whole month, I was only allowed to hang out with my mom, basically.
Wow.
Because like you, my mom takes extremely good care of me. We would be nowhere without our moms.
Yeah.
And so my mom was through that whole thing, the entire process, like extremely helpful, kept me at all my appointments, make sure I had all my medications, yada, yada, yada.
She didn't have to like go with me either, but she always did.
Yeah, she would always go to all my appointments with me. And during the second transplant that I did, I mean, she was still going to work and then coming to see me after, and then like she was doing a lot, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
she, like you said, is an angel. But that second time, I was only able to see my mom for a month straight. Like there was points like where I snuck my dad into the hospital and like would go downstairs to see him once I was like finally cleared to get
Mm-hmm.
off the floor. But there was definitely times when I would go nuts sitting in that hospital bed, um,
Yeah.
dealing with some of the side effects that I was dealing with, which, like you said, were sometimes random. Um, that was definitely crazy. Even the most recent time I had got out of the hospital finally after like 3 weeks or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and then I had a fever just like you, and was admitted into the hospital again. They gave me a whole bunch of antibiotics that
Mm-hmm.
actually caused a different infection, which
What?
kept me in the hospital
Jeez.
for another week afterwards. So that was definitely um, the time when I was mentally going nuts trying to
Yeah.
like
What
get out of the hospital.
Yeah, so for me, the mental struggle at first was boredom, but then it definitely turned into combined with the sleep deprivation. Because when you're in a hospital, they're taking your vitals every 4 hours. You don't
Every
get a
four
good
hours.
period to sleep. And once I'm sleep deprived, I found out I would essentially, every time I'd try to go to bed, the moment I'd close my eyes, I'd already be having such vivid, like, dreams that my body
Hmm.
wouldn't be paralyzed yet. So I'd close my eyes, and like 20 seconds later, my arms would end up flailing, reacting to what was going on in my head. And there
Yeah.
was there was points where like I'd close my eyes, but I'd feel like my eyes were still open and I was still in the room. But there was like people in the room with me trying to hand me something, and I'd have to open my eyes to make sure that it wasn't real.
It wasn't.
Like it,
Wow.
it
Okay.
was on top of that, because of the chemo, I had neuropathy in both my hands and fingers, or and toes. So the bottom of my
Okay.
feet were completely staticky. They just felt like static, just
Like,
buzzing, and it felt like I was constantly being tickled. That
yeah.
was torture, because just sitting there moving my feet, trying not to feel like that on top of everything going on, the sleep deprivation, woozy from whatever meds they were giving me, it was a real struggle. And like there was nights I woke up and went to the bathroom and I was like, where am I? I'm like, dude, am I stuck here? Like, are they holding me against my will? Like, I legitimately started to think the hospital was like a cult. And then I very quickly was like, dude, there is something going on. Like, I'm not
Yeah.
all there right
Yeah.
now.
You know, it's crazy because I've had so many nights, right, where I'm in the hospital. I'm hooked up to all these bags, right? I can't sleep. I have weird side effects going on. Like one time, I had neuropathy at
Mm.
one point, in my hands and feet, but one time during my most recent transplant, my hands and feet were basically like they felt like they were on fire. Like my hands and feet were right? And so I
Really?
had ice packs on my hands and feet, and eventually they basically like my skin kind of like shed like a snake, and so my hands were hot and red, and then they like shed. Like it was basically like my hands were burning. I don't know, and all
Wow.
the skin came off. Some of my toenails actually like popped off. Like
Oh, yeah,
everything
yeah.
was just kind of dead. Yeah,
Hmm.
you know what I'm saying?
So yeah, so my neuropathy was a little bit opposite. Mine was, if I came in contact with cold, it felt like electrical shocks were going through my hands or feet, as well as my feet just felt really heavy constantly, and they still feel a little heavy, but it's gotten a lot better.
Hmm.
I noticed if I rubbed like the back of my leg, I'd feel the tingling go from my leg all the way down into my feet. And once I was finally off the chemo, that cold sensitivity turned to just straight numbness.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the neuropathy is weird. There's so many very like weird off side effects that right, and we all have different side effects, you
Yeah.
know, going through all of this. So it's pretty crazy. Um, Man, so you talk a lot about your mom. I talk a lot about my mom. What was your support like going through this whole situation from when you found out you had cancer? How did your friends and your family deal with it?
Honestly, I think both my parents took it harder than I did. There was a shock, and there's definitely a level of like repression in my head for sure. You know, when you're going through it and it's your reality, there's no room for emotions. You just have to get through it, you know? But seeing the way it affected my parents, I kept a very strong face. I was always optimistic. Even when I had doubts in my head, I never let it show. I always just fought as hard as I could because at the end of the day, I wasn't going to let myself die. I love my life too much to allow that to just happen. So,
Yes.
I mean, especially with the amount of support I did have. I did have, like, my brothers were all there. I have a really good friend. Her name's Gabby. Met her the semester when I started having issues. So I had began talking to her. We had studied, and we had just grown really close friends. I'm still friends with her to this day. Probably one of my most genuine and best friends. But she visited me in the hospital. Like, I was allowed one person in the hospital, but I was allowed to change which one person was there. So if my mom was there and then she left and my aunt could come and it's like I could alternate people. So certain days different people would come and that helped a lot. But overall my support systems were good. My headspace was pretty good, you know, in the midst of the battle. I never let the intrusive thoughts ever get to me like you're gonna die or anything like that. It was always I know you feel like shit right now, but this isn't forever. And overall, I think I'm actually grateful for the experience. It taught me a lot. It got my eating habits in check. It also gave me a really good moratorium period to really figure out what it is I wanted to do in life. Right before I was going to school for cybersecurity, didn't enjoy it. I just wanted to do it because it's a job I could do remotely for good money. I wanted to travel the world. That was my self-proclaimed dream at the time, but through this whole experience, I really went more into my... I've always had a knack for helping people in whatever way I can. So through this experience, especially through my suffering and understanding, meeting a lot of other people going through the same thing, I jumped around with what I wanted to do for a while. I said I wanted to be like a high school teacher all of a sudden, and the stem from that was I wanted to be available at a point in a lot of kids' lives where I feel like it's very turbulent and very easy for them to go down the wrong path. But I also know teachers are underappreciated, underrespected, underpaid, and when you're dealing with a bad student, you're often dealing with not very good parents. And it's just a lot to deal with for so little pay. So I settled on something that checks all my boxes, being psychology. I definitely still want to work with high school-aged kids, so I'm going to school right now. I'm about to transfer out to Texas. I want to get my master's, and I want to work within a high school to be like a high school counselor. And honestly, I hope that's my end-all be-all. I don't care that it doesn't pay well. If I'm happy there, I plan to stay there for the rest of my life. And if it's not, then my next step, it would be go back to school, get my doctorate, and specialize in therapy for the same-aged kids.
Yeah. That's cool. That's crazy. Like, full circle, how, again, like we said, you get something like cancer. It's really cool to see that what I always say and call it is like tragedy to triumph.
Yes.
And I agree with you, man. Like, I tell people, like, cancer was one of the best things that happened to me. It made me, it changed my perspective on, like you said, you're more grateful for little things. Like, I'm grateful to wake up and get out of my bed in the morning. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Small things like that, small and big things, obviously. But it changes your perspective. It also, right, it gave you purpose. It gave you a better understanding of who you are to yourself. There's probably a lot of time to think, like you said, and it gave you purpose and it helped you figure out things in your life, which I think is a great way to be able to look at something like cancer. And that's why I have you on here sharing this story, man, because it's so inspiring that you can look at it at cancer that way, that you were able to, what I always say is lead by example with your attitude through this whole situation. So the people that supported you were confident in everything that you, like, that's tough. And not everybody, dude, I've done a bunch of these interviews. Not everybody is able to kind of face a cancer battle like that. So
Yeah.
that's like I respect you. Like it's crazy.
Thank you.
That's really awesome that you're able to do that.
Thank you. The psychological term for it is post-traumatic grief. I learned this last semester. It's essentially when good comes out of a really bad situation. And more notably, I don't know what your music preferences are, but I'm sure you know who Linkin Park is.
Yeah.
One of their new songs is called Good Things Go. That song, I think, is so beautiful because the main line of the song is sometimes bad things take the place where good things go. And I think that's very true in not just a health perspective, but in a life perspective. You know, you're supposed to have good parents, but not everybody gets one. You know, there's so many factors in life where things are supposed to be good, but they're just not. And it's just how it is, and it's just what you have to live with. But in the end, if you learn from all those all the adversity, it ends up becoming your strength.
Yeah. I like that a lot. I like to say that things aren't like good or bad, right? Like things are just things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened. And right, like you said, you were very optimistic through this whole situation. Like you can look at it, perceive it, however you can think about it how you want to think about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you take out the good and bad in things, because right, like you don't know the future, so like you can't put expectations on stuff. Like you don't know what's actually going to happen. Even if you have the perfect plan, nothing really ever goes according to plan.
No,
You know what I'm saying?
yeah, no.
So
Yesterday was a very, very apparent reminder that the moment you start to make plans in life, life says no.
yeah, life does what life does, right? So when you don't put expectations and you just take things as they are and you think about them like rationally or morally, right? And you make decisions, and as long as you just keep moving forward, right? Like you're doing all that you can do. You know what
Yeah,
I'm saying?
yeah,
Um,
and I definitely want to take my experiences and help people with them. Like very, especially like I currently work like at a smoke shop CBD store. But I've had a few people walk in where either their like husband or them themselves are going through a cancer treatment, and my experience allows me to empathize and potentially give them advice that'll help. Especially with products. One thing that really helped me, it was a drink called Enterade. It's a chemo formulated essentially like think of like a what do they call it, like an electrolyte drink, but it's
mhm.
formulated by oncologists for people undergoing chemo, and it's super good for anti-nausea. Once I found those were a lot better than the four meds they were actually
Than the
giving me.
medications.
Yeah.
I could imagine. Though, look, right, like I took at least Zofran. I don't
Hmm.
think I took two medications. I don't remember the other. I think it was Compazine and Zofran.
Those are the
I
two
think.
pills.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I those never helped me with my
No, they
nausea.
never helped me either. They gave me a mend that helped a little bit. Ativan made me feel so out of it that I guess I wasn't nauseous, but it wasn't a good feeling anyways.
Yeah.
Those Enterades were a lifesaver, and then in between chemos, never while on it, just because drug interactions, I would turn to cannabis for my appetite because my appetite was really
Yeah.
bad. And
Yeah.
that's the only reason I was actually able to gain weight during all of it.
Right.
And for reference, going into like in January, I was 140 pounds of 2023. And then in like March, when I was hospitalized after my first chemo, I was 133 pounds, and I'm five
Oh
foot
wow.
ten, so
Yeah.
133 was like really, really like bone skinny for me.
Yeah.
And I have a
Right.
video of when my hair started falling out. My neighbor's daughter actually cut it off, and you can see in that video how skinny my arms were.
Yeah.
Um, but after that, I was able to slowly, because I wouldn't really be able to eat on the weekends. So when
Mm.
I was every other weekend, because I was on chemo for 48 hours. I don't know if I mentioned that.
Okay.
So I would go home with a bag that stayed infusing for essentially, I'd go in Monday, come back Wednesday, and get it taken out. So I was 48
Yeah.
hours of chemo every 2 weeks.
Hmm.
So that whole like weekend or whatever those days that I was on chemo, it was as much sleep as I could get. Try to drink the little water if I could that I could without getting nauseous, and it's just the moment I got it pulled out, getting home, relaxing, waiting till like later that night, and then the one thing that actually helped the nausea go away.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally advocate for that, man. Like you said, the cannabis helps you eat. It just helps your body. It seems like it helps everything
Hmm.
just move smoother.
Yeah, it
Um,
definitely helped.
what was like after your chemo every 2 weeks? How long did it take you to feel like somewhat normal? Obviously, you went back every 2 weeks and started again, but like, what
So
was that like?
I think the most common schedule for me was I go in on a Friday. No, it wasn't. It was I go in on a Wednesday. They put in. I go back on Friday. They take it out. That first day after always felt like iffy. Wasn't too good. The day after that, cannabis. Literally, the moment I ingested cannabis, it was like nothing was wrong. I don't know like how to explain it, but it was I didn't feel horrible anymore.
Mm,
And it really did help, but it is also still a substance that I still struggle not to use now,
mm,
just because. But it's definitely had its place during my
yes.
treatment, and it was very beneficial. But I think there is still a level, especially with my personality, where it's a little difficult to get off of things. And
Yeah.
me myself, I've never been somebody that liked doing anything like that. Like I've never drank a sip of alcohol in my life.
Yeah.
The only thing I've ever done is smoke cannabis.
Hmm.
So, and I know the way I am. I'm a little bit of an addictive personality, so
Yeah.
that's why I have the restraint in order to never try things like alcohol, because I know if I did, it would be difficult for me not to want to try it again, especially when it's so
Yeah.
socially acceptable.
Right. I totally get that. Cool. Um, well, to finish, to wrap this up, the last question I have for you, what would you tell somebody that's maybe going through cancer, like you and I, or just going through some type of challenge, big or small? What kind of advice would you give them to get through their challenges?
So one thing I saw somebody say when I was younger that always resonated with me is, and it was said by a cancer patient, is you can't always wait for things to be good to start enjoying life. And even if like things are bad, you're in the middle of treatment, like take your mind off the treatment for a second, take a nice deep breath, look at the beautiful sky, and just take it in. Because even though you're going through all the really shitty stuff, like, there's still a lot of beauty in the fact that you're still breathing. And I'd say, especially for people who are starting to go through it, maybe just found out or are in the process, it's always scariest at first when you don't know what's going on. Once you have more answers, even if the answers aren't like the best, at least having an answer, knowing what the next step is, what you're doing, and what you're striving for, is a lot more comforting than being in the dark. So if you were recently diagnosed, I'd say talk to your doctors, ask all your questions. There's a lot of comfort in knowing what's going on. And I think most importantly, don't listen to, like, if you search up on Google the mortality rate for a lot of cancers, I never pay attention to those for one reason. And that's because that is an average based off of a population that is heavily skewed towards older. So, especially if you're somebody who's younger with cancer, that percentage isn't an accurate representation of your chances. But rather, if you take the steps to take care of yourself, even if it's a 20% mortality rate you're looking at, you'll be a part of that 20% if you really fight for it.
Yeah.
It's all about mindset.
Yep. I agree. I agree. Cool. Well, thanks. Thanks so much for
Thank you
coming
for
on
having
here and
me.
sharing your story, man. I really appreciate it. That's all we have for today on this episode of Beast vs. Zombie. Thank you for joining and listening to me and Christian talk about cancer today. I hope this motivates and inspires you. that not only can you overcome cancer, but you can overcome any challenges in your life, big and small. Please make sure to go follow the podcast on all social media, subscribe on YouTube and Spotify to see the full videos, the full episodes, and stay up to date on new episodes coming out every other week. Make sure, last but not least, to share with your friends and family, because everybody has challenges they got going on. Even if they aren't disclosing them to you guys, anybody can get inspiration and motivation from these stories we have going on. So again, thanks for tuning in. Be a beast.